So an emergency manager would logically come to the conclusion that we need to make emergency managers as obsolete as possible. If you don't agree with that, it might be due to my phrasing. So let me rephrase that in another way. The ideal situation is one where the public is so prepared they don't need you or me or any of us. This video has been a bit difficult for me to make, to be honest. This is probably I think this is the fourth go at it. First time I was just too angry. John, the editor, sent a Reddit post in and asked me to reply to it. And it cuts to the core of some of the issues that I've noticed with emergency preparedness for a long time. This is something that colleagues in the industry that I've known for years and years and years have talked about. It cuts a bit close to home, basically. I've had to go through this a few times. I wrote a piece on it to get the thoughts out, and I've tried to kind of take some of the emotion and anger out of it, and I've tried to make this more productive. In responding to this, because this is going to be someone basically asking for my personal input or how I'm viewing something, this is going to be very biased from my perspective and from the perspective of what we've kind of observed in the industry at Prepared Canada. So there's a lot of trust me, bro, in this, but the request is for personalized feedback. So with that in mind, the question that was posed in r/emergency management, I'm curious how emergency management consultants have been impacted by everything that's happened since January 2025. I'm not only talking about the massive hits to FEMA and the federal funding cuts and disruptions, although those are huge. I'm also talking about things like AI being increasingly more widely adopted and how that impacts what clients are willing to pay for services. How is you/your firm doing? I can say that in my tiny corner, it's been seismic. LinkedIn posts increasingly feel like headstones in the graveyard of an entire profession, but I don't know if that applies to everyone. Would be interesting in hearing from others. Okay, I'm going to try really hard not to get mad. I'm going to try really hard. I wrote about a 2,000 word piece here. It should go up around the same time as this video goes up. I'm going to reference back to it because I think it'll be better to keep my thoughts together. And I'm going to be referring back to basically what I wrote here to kind of guide me as like cue cards, because I think it will keep this more on point and will stop me from rambling. One of the versions of this video was 40 minutes of me just ranting, and it wasn't good entertainment for you guys. It wasn't as productive. Okay. There are a few things that feed into this. There are a few sort of broad realities that affect emergency management as a whole that are going to inform my answer to this question. My answer to this question is fundamentally going to be that this industry was destined to shrink. We are sort of oversaturated with professionals, and sort of the reality of the way emergency management works means that if you're looking to get into this profession and you want to make it a career that's going to sustain a family, especially as a single income, it's very tough and it's not realistic, and you should probably look elsewhere and use your time better. There's a lot that goes into this though, so let me break this out. The four things that I outlined here for sort of other things that come in and affect this are: one, there is a fundamental misunderstanding of what emergency managers actually do and what the scope of emergency management actually is. There is a significant portion of people who work in this industry that don't do work that is exclusively work that emergency management professionals are specialized in, and they're basically overpaid volunteers. I'll get into that in a sec, but that's the first sort of topic. The second, there is a huge amount of variance in the emergency management labor market. It has huge cycles of hiring and firing, and there's small bursts of massive demand and then a tapering off process. This means that the employment within the industry is not steady, and you run into these problems where the industry will overhire in certain year periods and then will fire en masse. And then in those low periods, all of the people that they fired are so experienced that the entry-level stuff is washed out. And this cyclically happens constantly. So it's a very difficult industry to break into in general. The third thing, there are a lot of snake oil salesmen in this industry. There is a huge percentage of this industry of people that are frankly incompetent. And this is usually the part where I start getting angry, because it's something that the competent people in the industry have to deal with all the time. You're always having to fight the reputation that somebody else has put in place that is sort of destroyed or harmed your reputation by proxy. Other industries deal with this, of course, as well too, but it's particularly bad in some parts in this industry. And then the fourth thing is a lot of the work that emergency managers do in practice in the field is very low skill and is easy to automate. And getting into that, before I get into this breakdown of the four things, I'm going to talk about what emergency managers specifically do that is unique to them. So if you're someone who works with emergency management, with business continuity, with disaster risk reduction, there's a lot of bleed over in those industries. If you're one of those types of specialists with a specific look at emergency management in particular, there are things that they do uniquely that no one else really does the same way. And this is sort of the core competency that is very difficult to replicate or replace with AI, or that is difficult to, fire out of your organization entirely or move around. This is where the crux of a lot of this comes in. So I'm going to break that down first. This is a pretty much exhaustive, there's one or two other little things, but this is pretty much an exhaustive list of the reasons why you would want an emergency manager specifically. The first thing that they're going to do within the planning process, if you have the 5 sectors of emergency management, there are 5 pillars. You have prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. Sometimes mitigation and prevention are merged together, but those are the 5 things. We've talked about them extensively on the channel. Within that, in the planning process, there's something that emergency managers uniquely do, which is called a HIRA. HIRAs, or hazard identification risk assessments, are something that we've taught about on this channel. In the Continuity 101 textbook and the playlist in here, which is free, Chapter 3 on risk assessments will walk you through how to do a custom HIRA. Emergency management people specifically do HIRAs, and no one else really does them. Health and safety does something close, but the way it's viewed with emergency management and these sort of systems is a bit different. We do custom HIRAs. We do ones where the likelihood and the consequence sections of the graph are custom built. So with other organizations and other industries, what you'll often do is there will be an industry standard and you overlay your risk on top of that industry standard. In this sort of field though, your risk profile is unique to your organization. You can't even copy your competitors because every organization is different. You can't even copy your own from 5 years ago because the organization has changed so much in those 5 years that the one from 5 years ago is actually out of date and irrelevant. It is incredibly important that these breakpoints in a risk assessment, or in a HIRA more specifically, are custom tailored and built to the organization for that snapshot in time. That is something that uniquely emergency managers do, and because of the process in which the way this is done, AI cannot effectively do this. The hallucination risk is way too high, and you need an expert that can check for very specific, minute details or errors in the subjective inputs they're getting from the business owner or the city planner or whoever. That piece is something that only emergency management professionals or people in adjacent industries, disaster risk reduction, business continuity, only they will do this. No one else does this. So that's the first one. The second thing is emergency management people will look at risk holistically. Now, when I say the word holistic, some people start thinking of debates between Eastern and Western medicine and the like, but just put that aside for now if that's where your mind is going. The idea with sort of looking at risk holistically is when there is a fire, for example, the emergency manager will consider what happens because of the fire, but they will also consider what happens when the fire knocks out the power grid, and the knockout of the power grid creates a secondary hazard and what that will do. Using COVID as an example of COVID-19 pandemic, from a medical risk standpoint, if you have your medical officer of health or your head doctor tell you what to do, you're going to get really good medical advice, and they're going to tell you what to do to make sure nobody gets sick. And in the process, they're going to destroy your economy and ruin your education system. Now, that might be an exchange you're willing to do. You might be okay making that choice, but the doctor is not considering the secondary effects. You're asking them for medical advice. They're giving you medical advice and they're saying, this is what you do if you want to solve this problem. They're a specialist. It's the same thing. You go to your family doctor, for example, and, you ask them what to do for this or that treatment, or because you have this or that disease, and they tell you what you should do. And then what do? You don't do it because you have other things in your life and you decide not to because you're calculating all these other factors. With the emergency manager, they will listen to the specialist advice that's based on the hazard, but then they will look at, okay, so based on what you've suggested, this and this and this and this and this and this will occur, or likely to occur. So we need to put something in place to address these risks Or we need to think about whether we're willing to assume the negative consequences of your risk control or of your solution. So they look at the whole situation. They look at the entire chessboard. When an individual specialist like a doctor, like a fire chief, like a police officer focusing on their crime scene, whatever, has a specific lane that they're staying in, and they're trained to stay in that lane, and they should be, and they're doing their job. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. When they're in that lane and they're not going outside of sort of where they're supposed to go, it's the emergency manager's job to take all of these different lanes and look at it from the bird's eye view and go, oh, wait a minute, we're about to have this problem. We got to call this other guy to bring them in because they can solve this. That's something that uniquely only they do. Now, leadership, so like elected officials or the heads of organizations, these are your CEOs, these are your city managers, these are your prime ministers, your presidents, your mayors, etc. Their leadership and decision makers are supposed to do this as well. But emergency management specifically informs them because the emergency manager is trained to do this while there's an ongoing bad situation. In non-normal operations, all the stuff is on fire. The CEO, the mayor, the what have you, is supposed to get elected to deal with normal everyday. If you've ever heard the difference between, this is often brought up, but the difference between a peacetime and a wartime leader, how, wartime leaders generally aren't very good in peacetime and peacetime leaders aren't very good in wartime because they think differently or they view problems differently. This is very similar to emergency management. Emergency management is more like that wartime leader where they're focused on knowing how to make high pressure decisions in very, very bad situations where something has to get resolved so you can get back to peacetime. And then when it is peacetime, they're focused on getting ready for the next wartime so they can be ready again. But they basically get out of your way during peacetime, effectively. They just want to make sure we're more prepared for the next wartime. Now, in this case, war doesn't have to be necessarily conflict. It could be a flood, it could be a wildfire, whatever. It's during the time of the incident. But it's a different way of thinking that you don't generally elect wartime leaders because most of the time you're in peacetime. You generally elect peacetime leaders and you want an emergency manager to help them make wartime decisions so you can get back to peacetime faster. That's the idea. When things get too extreme and you're always in wartime, then you just elect a wartime leader and the emergency manager gets elected effectively. But that's kind of the way to view this. Okay. The third thing that I've already alluded to a bit is the emergency management person is very often the only person in your area that is used to working during the feces show or working during the really bad situation. They're the abnormal operations specialist. They know the difference, or they should know the difference, between regular operations, an emergency, a disaster, and a catastrophe, and why those are defined differently and how you have to change the way you communicate, the way you try to reestablish order, the way you have to operate in these different situations. They're specialists in this. This is something that you don't replicate out. This is something that AI cannot do because when your situation goes to heck and everything, you don't have power usually. You don't have the resources that would be required, or you can't guarantee the resources that would be required to run the AI system or to run the advanced computing. You go back to analog very quickly, and you need someone that can operate with very little resources and reestablish society with basically nothing but willpower. And then, finding resources, getting people together and sort of reestablishing our human networks. This is something that emergency managers do. This is something that uniquely they do. It's not that police and fire and emergency and medical services, they help out in disasters, but they're not rebuilding society and looking at all the different moving parts. They're frontline, they're helping to evacuate that person over there because that person needs help. It's important work, it has to get done, but that's not rebuilding society. It's not the same discipline, it's not the same specialization. The final thing that emergency managers do uniquely is they will be sort of a jargon translator. So you have a meeting. Let's say this is during response generally, but sometimes it happens during planning too. So you have a meeting in an operations center. We call them EOCs, emergency operations centers. So there's a lot of jargon in this, but we say EOC all the time. You have a meeting in an operations center and the police chief, the fire chief, the chief of your paramedic services, the city solicitor or lawyer, the mayor, the city manager, the representative from the power company, or any of their alternates are all at the table. And you're trying to make a decision once every 4 hours or 2 hours or whatever your operational period is on what we're going to be doing for the next some amount of time. All of these people usually are very strong personalities. There's a reason why they've succeeded in leadership. There's a reason why they've made it to the top of these hierarchies in these fairly authoritarian organizations. A lot of these response agencies are very military-ish sort of in nature and structure. If you're the head of that, you tend to be someone who knows how to get what they want. These people will often have the best interests of the public at heart, but they will have a different way of viewing that, a different way of interpreting that. And they will also kind of be siloed in such a way where they'll be used to saying the jargon that's normal for their organization very often. And when they kind of leave that, they'll forget that half of what they just said might as well have been a different language. The emergency manager is the person that probably has a good relationship with all of these different people and also has worked to learn all of their different jargon or translate at least some of it. This means that when personality clashes come into play, the emergency manager is the friend of everybody in the room that can kind of get people back on task if you have difficult personalities. In my experience, you don't often have difficult personalities that get in the way with these sorts of individuals. Usually the heads of emergency services and etc. are very professional, very high functioning. You don't have these sorts of issues, but it can happen, especially under stress. And the emergency manager is kind of like the calm within the storm. The other thing is, sometimes, you'll mention, we have this thing happening. One of them will come up with a solution, and the solution is filled with 10% words that everybody else in the room does not understand. And you can see their eyes glaze over. Or you can see them go, what did they just say? And the emergency manager is often the person who is effectively being the professional jargon translator to go, okay, when you said that, what I'm getting is this. Is that correct? And they go, no, this. Got it. So it's this. And they go, yes. I go, everybody got that? Yes. Okay, good. So sometimes you can catch that so people can be on the same page in real time. And otherwise, just like running the meeting. That's something that uniquely emergency managers do in high pressure situations. Those are the 4 things. Other than that, virtually everything else that they do is something that somebody else can do. And here's a list of those things. If you want to have someone set up your emergency operations center for you, so setting up the actual EOC, running the cables, etc., you have facilities people that are part of 911 dispatch and part of your other services. Your police, civilian staff, a large percentage of them can do all of that work. You don't need emergency managers for that. Your insurance specialists for damage assessments. When there's a disaster and a whole bunch of homes are destroyed or businesses, whatever, you need to do damage assessments for insurance and etc. The reality is that there are significant amounts of people who are trained in the insurance industry, and there are private companies that do this sort of thing that can be called upon for damage assessment. You don't really need a background in emergency management to know how to do damage assessment. Someone else can do this. If you're being hired explicitly for that purpose, you're going to be made obsolete pretty quickly. There's a lot of work in making a risk assessment around analyzing hazards. Let's say you have a flood, right? And you're an emergency manager and you want to do something for flood risk. You're not doing the assessment and the analysis. A hydrologist is. Let's say that you're worried about a pandemic or, a disease outbreak. You're not doing the assessment. Public health probably is. Let's say you're worried about crime risk or certain types of gun crime in your city. Police are doing that for you, whatever. There's going to be some sort of hazard-specific specialist that is doing the actual assessment for you in virtually every case. You don't generally pay emergency management people to do the data gathering. You'll pay them for kind of the compiling and for really the setting up of the structure of the HIRA. But if the HIRA structure has already been given to you, you can automate the emergency manager's part of that process almost entirely. Like, they have a very specific role within risk management, and the rest of it can basically be automated. As far as a lot of the disaster work and response, filling sandbags, running shelters, doing all sort of the frontline work, you have unpaid volunteers that do almost all of this. People, when a bad thing happens, will come together and help out. You're not paying somebody over $100,000 a year to fill sandbags. I have many colleagues in this field that have been basically put in positions where, because of an oversaturation of people in the field, they're effectively volunteer workers that are getting paid to do something that is significantly lower skill than what they've been trained for. So those jobs aren't going to be made obsolete by AI. Those jobs will be made obsolete by free labor because people will just show up to help. Another thing that emergency managers kind of do uniquely, but someone else could do it, is they're often the liability magnet, kind of like they're the scapegoat. So when something bad happens and you need to make a whole bunch of tough decisions, you want somebody who can take the fall often in these sorts of systems, and that's usually placed on someone in the emergency management team. This is one of the reasons why we're so frequently focused on knowing how to use scribes, on how to sort of CYA cover your behind, right? That whole thing, because you need to know how to not get sued. And the organization needs to know how to escape getting sued. And there's the question of, was it the right decision now or with hindsight? And can you prove that even though in hindsight it was the wrong decision, that at the time it was the right decision? That sort of phenomena or that sort of challenge is something that your emergency management people will generally handle, but other people could handle. Frankly, your legal team could be handling a lot of this fundamentally. This isn't something that's unique to emergency management at all. So I know that was a lot of like broad context and stuff, but now we're going to go point by point, looking at sort of the four major phenomena that feed into this, or the four things that I wanted to talk about that feed into this. So the first, the scope. Looking at the scope of emergency management and how poorly it's understood. Emergency management fundamentally is a leadership function. It is not something that runs a shelter. It is not a replacement for police. It is not a first response unit. Emergency management is the thing that advises leadership directly through some method. Your risk assessment is a tool to make decisions with leadership. Your emergency operations center is a logistics and communications hub to assist with coordinating a command structure, which is a leadership function. You're a leadership assist utility, fundamentally. A lot of people think of emergency management as all the frontline workers of FEMA. And no, they're doing work within an emergency management structure, sure, but that's not really what your core competency is. Your core competency is putting order in chaos in an information management system, effectively is what you're doing. If your emergency management person for the city is housed in the public health unit, then they're thinking from the perspective of public health, and they have to go through too many chains to get to the leader that they're actually doing the risk for. Remember when I talked about how they have the holistic approach? Because of this, it is critically important that your emergency management person be as close to the decision maker for whatever scope they're operating within. Your city emergency manager should be housed next to the city decision maker, which is either your city manager or your mayor. Your state or provincial emergency manager should be housed with your governor or premier respectively, because their leadership, their command information functions. Many municipalities will do this. They'll dual role their fire chief or their fire commissioner as their director of emergency management because they're trying to save money. What will happen with this is, because this person is dual rolled and their primary job is to be a specific risk specialist, they're always going to have this pressure to focus on the thing that they are a specialist in. So everything is a fire. Even if they know everything isn't even a fire, even if they were an emergency manager before they were a fire chief, which is almost never the case, they're kind of pushed towards thinking from the perspective of a specific hazard, which means they're not thinking holistically. This makes them a very ineffective emergency manager, generally speaking, compared to if you basically could clone them and let one of them do the fire thing and let one of them do the EM thing. They're wearing too many hats. It makes both of their hat wearing less effective, or they have to sacrifice one of them. It's too much work. Running an entire fire service is a difficult enough job as it is, without having to basically think of the economic impact that's going to happen, that's going to shut down this, and this thing, based on the fire that you're doing. It's way too much work on one person. So people do not really appreciate the scope of this. There are going to be people in this field that hear this, that are dual rolled like that. They're going to be mad at what I just said because they think that they can do everything. I'll just politely say that I disagree. And then there are going to be many people who frankly are not in this field, that are making the budgets for this field, that force them into this position because they do not understand how this works. And that, I think, is sort of the biggest crux here. The reality is a lot of these services do not have the budgets to separate these two things, and then they force them together because of some mandatory compliance. They have to have a certain number of emergency management professionals in their given municipality. And because of that, this core discipline just is thrown to the wayside. If your fire chief is your emergency manager, you're not hiring any emergency managers. You're just going to hire from within the fire department and say, okay, you're doing this too in your portfolio. Good luck. Please comment and like and subscribe and tell us how much you agree with that. The 3 fire chiefs I talked to recently that said that to me point blank. So the 2 things I outline in this are, 1, the distance in the organization to the person that's making the decision. You want to be direct line. You don't want to be going through you to your manager, to this other department, to that department's manager, to your mayor. You want to be direct line to mayor, direct line to city planner. And then the bias within your organization. Like, look, you can have emergency managers in the fire department. You can have emergency managers in your power company, in your public health unit. That's fine, but they should be reporting to the leadership of that organization. The emergency manager for the fire department should be doing emergency management for the fire department, not for the city. Emergency management for the public health department should be doing emergency management for the public health department, not for the region or city, right? You should be thinking about it from the perspective of that organization. You shouldn't be doing work for an organization that isn't you within a different organization. It doesn't work. There are very few people that can actually do that. And even the ones that can are way less effective than if they were just in the correct position. Fine. Okay. We talked about that. Great. Okay. Let's talk about the high variance in the EM labor market. Let me think about how I'm going to say this. Okay, bad thing happens. There's an earthquake, 1,000 people die. It's a very, very bad day. The public comes together and says, we're never going to let that happen again. Right after that happens, if you do a bunch of planning work and etc., what will often occur, if people actively care, is they will hire a bunch of people into emergency management to try to stop that thing from happening again. So there will be a huge hiring wave, and then the field will balloon. Then, as what happens with virtually all preparedness measures, people will forget, they will stop caring one way or another, and they will start cutting into the budget and firing people over time. And it will get lower and lower and lower and lower until another big thing happens again that reminds people. There have been movies made about emergency management people or people who work in risk that cause disasters maliciously to try to get people to care more about the issue again, which, speaks to unhinged thinking, but also the frustration that people will have with people not caring about preparedness. The reality is that in order to solve this problem, you'd have to have frequent enough disasters where people basically never forget and they always keep getting reminded that they appreciate the existence of emergency managers. However, if you did that, the focus would be so stressful that the population would be forced to basically improve its technology so rapidly to stop those from disasters occurring. And then you would have this happen anyways. So the phenomenon would persist because you'd have less disasters. So emergency management employment is basically cyclical. It keeps going, disaster hits, boom, we employ, and then people forget, disaster hits, right? And it follows that sort of cycle. And the drop off is really, really quick. So usually people will forget, or you'll start seeing these units start getting cut in under 30 years. And 30 years might seem like a long time, but when you're looking at an industry undergoing massive shrinkage, it's actually not that long. Let's say recently the thing that's referenced in this is President Trump in America cutting the budget of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, by a significant percentage, cutting the budget, and then the labor market getting flooded with emergency managers. When you're hiring and you can choose between the new grad and the person who's been a director for 10 years, you're taking the director every time. The director's willing to take the frontline work at the price of the new grad, and they're a director. You get someone who's worth $200,000 a year for 40 grand. You're taking the director. Universities will pump out a huge number of graduates relative to the size of this industry, and the industry is this constant shrinking problem. This has a chilling effect on the universities where people eventually realize that their job prospects are negligible at best and the industry is too tough. And this reduces the number of people willing to do research. The whole industry, the whole supply chain shrinks. Then a disaster happens and there aren't enough people left to rehire, and you have to go into panic hiring. This sort of thing happens constantly in the industry and is a natural progression. It's not sustainable, and a risk manager looking at this as a phenomenon would likely come to the conclusion that it's in our best interest to try to automate out or focus on mitigation and prevention strategies, essentially, and remove the risk associated with the emergency management labor market. So an emergency manager would logically come to the conclusion that we need to make emergency managers as obsolete as possible. If you don't agree with that, it might be due to my phrasing. So let me rephrase that in another way. The ideal situation is one where the public is so prepared they don't need you or me or any of us. That's the ideal situation. And it is sort of the end goal of this whole industry to get to that place. That's the problem. The solution to this is that at some point in emergency management, the goal is for it to effectively be free. You have an issue if you're seeking employment in that system. Okay, snake oil. And I'm going to try to not get mad. I'm going to try to not get angry here. I have failed that challenge for at least 2 tapings of this, but we're going to try really hard. Okay. In my experience, in the experience of virtually every colleague I've spoken to on this, over half of this industry is selling snake oil. Over half of this industry is essentially wasting clients' time and is not doing the work that they're advertising that they're doing. The reason why they often get away with this, in my opinion, is because the expertise is so specific that the client can't realistically tell the difference between snake oil and legitimately good work. If an individual can tell the difference between those two things reliably, they probably have such an advanced skill set in this already that they likely don't need to hire the consultant. One example for this would be if an individual fundamentally understands the need for not copy pasting likelihood and consequences in a HIRA, then they probably know how to do a HIRA. And then why do they need you? There's some argument for maybe they need you for some touch-ups or something, but in principle, most of the consulting work, if they already know that specific, they probably don't need you anyways. You'll see similar phenomena in a lot of IT work and cybersecurity and stuff like that. People who work in cybersecurity will know exactly what I'm talking about, where you see a similar thing where the client doesn't necessarily know the difference, but if you're an expert, you know the difference. But if you're an expert, why do you need to hire another you? What will often happen is, so at the start of, you contact one of these companies that comes in, I'm assuming a snake oil company in this case, they'll charge you a very, very large amount of money. They'll bring in usually a whole bunch of people in suits with clipboards. They will hand out what it amounts to essentially surveys in some form in an Excel spreadsheet or something, but you'll basically do a bunch of surveys. They'll survey a whole bunch of the staff. They will take that survey data back. They will plug it into a pseudo-automated program that they use to compile data. That program will spit out a plan based on a template, and that template will then be handed to you as the main deliverable, and thank you for your fee. No one will be trained on this. No one will basically read it, and it will sit on a shelf. It'll be some 500-page plan. This is why I bring this up all the time in the advertising for the book and everything. But this is, the 500-page plan that collects dust on a shelf. It's a complete waste of time. This is common practice. More often than not, when I go into a business and I see what they're doing, I find that this is what they've actually purchased, and we end up going in and offering them a service that they think is comparable at a 100th of the cost, in many cases, at 1% of the cost, that ends up being better for them. And the turnaround time for that is, a week instead of 6 months. There is so much bloat in a lot of the snake oil stuff in this industry that is just ineffective and a waste of time. It's incredible. I don't want to get into saying things about specific companies here because I can get very agitated, but there are numerous examples that are well known in this industry of companies internally or otherwise plans being copied that contain things that make absolutely no sense. I'm going to reference one, and every one of you that knows this space will know what I'm talking about. Are there walruses in the Gulf of Mexico? Did we proofread that plan? Did we even look at it at all? Or did we do Control-C, Control-V? Come on. Yes. Anyways, if you know, you know. The other significant issue with the snake oil stuff is we are constantly forced to defend ourselves against saying, but we're not actually that. And very often these companies will have very, very good marketing. They will go into a vertical of something that they came from, but they're not an emergency management specialist. They don't actually do this. What you'll very commonly see, these are examples, are people from the banking sector, people from policing, people from the broader financial sector in general, who don't learn emergency management or risk reduction skill sets, not these sorts of ones, that take what they're already doing and they essentially copy paste, call themselves one of these professionals, and go sell their services. And To the layperson that is running a business, someone was a director of risk in a bank, you assume that risk is risk and it's all the same and they must know what they're talking about. You don't know the difference fundamentally between financial risk management and disaster risk management, which are massively different disciplines. The police officer, well, they've seen all these things. They've managed these incidents. They must know how to deal with emergencies. Not necessarily. They know how to do the police function within an incident. They may have seen it be done, but when it comes to advising a leader on a complex system that has 50 subsequent effects, they're not trained in this as police. It's not one of their core competencies. They have a very specific core competency that people are going to get mad about police again because I'm saying good things about police. They do specific things very, very well, but they're specifically trained in a specific skill set. The emergency management is not the skill set they're trained in. Now, look, you can work at a bank, you can be a police officer, and then you can transition into this field and pick up the skill set and use your prior experience to augment it. Sure. But that's not what's happening in a lot of these cases. What's happening in a lot of these cases is they're just putting up BS. So you have to deal with a significant amount of that. Also, yeah, okay, anyways, I'm about to get mad. I'm just gonna namaste. Okay, there's a lot of low skill work that is easy to automate in emergency management. And this stuff AI is gonna replace, you're gonna replace with volunteers, etc. You can think about it this way. There are sort of three groups of the types of work that EM professionals do in their field. The first is stuff that you need the emergency management professional for. The second is stuff that you can get a different specialist to do. And the third is the stuff that can be automated. The first stuff you're going to keep the EM specialist for, or you're going to try to have a specialist like that for. You might want to save a bunch of money and multi-role it with your fire chief, fine, but you're going to want that designated emergency management person there for that. The different specialist stuff, you're saving money there. Okay, if your emergency management team is setting up EOCs and handing out food at shelters, it is an inefficient allocation of resources, and that job is not going to be there forever. Okay, it's just that job is going away. It's not practical. It's not realistic. People are going to get multi-rolled and do that for them because it's not one of their core competencies that only they can uniquely do. As for the automated stuff, as per what I sort of mentioned before, if you're not doing the specific types of things I'm talking about, if you're not manually doing high-res, your function can get replaced by a phone app. There are fitness apps on your phone for calorie counting that are more sophisticated than making a HIRA if you're not manually making the axes. This stuff is incredibly easy to automate if you're not bringing the expertise of what the emergency manager is supposed to actually be there for. Many of these things you can fully automate in an Excel spreadsheet. This is a joke. Some people in this industry do not appreciate the degree to which what they're doing is not special. Now, there are things you can do that are special, and we've outlined them, but there's a lot of people that aren't doing that. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is when you get down to that core few things that emergency management people are specifically good at, when you get down to that core, you don't need that many people to run an incident. In your EOC, for most incidents, you need one person in this field to do it. There was a situation in a city in Canada where there was a high-rise building fire. The high-rise building fire caused a significant fire response, and they hit the high-rise building with so much water that it flooded a transit line, like a subway line, and it took an entire line of a major metropolitan city subway off. It was gone. They had city flooding, trains got flooded out, damage, et cetera, because of the fire. So this is, for example, fire caused secondary effect of, et cetera. The number of emergency managers that were required to manage that was one person. Fire knows what it's doing. The transit people know what they're doing. You needed one person in the office to basically check emails and be at the phone in case someone had to declare an emergency, so emergency powers could be put into play. To some people, that sounds horrible, but that's not a difficult incident. That's not complicated. There was a case in Canada where a tornado came down and wiped out a neighborhood. The number of dispatchers in their fire department on staff was one, let alone emergency managers. Like, the 911 dispatchers for that fire department, one person. They had a team of one for picking up the phone, okay? Like, you don't need many cooks in this kitchen. Your whole staff, if you have 8-hour shifts, is 3 person for each 8-hour shift effectively, maybe a few extra people for days off, but then you basically have 6 total because you have the 3 people and then their alternates, and that's your entire staff, and only one's in the building at any given time, really, and you have like 2, in some periods for handover, but you don't need huge staff for this. Like, a lot of these departments are massively overstaffed because they're not doing emergency management work. They have people doing pointless work, essentially, because it can be multi-rolled. Now, look, that's not enough people for Hurricane Katrina. You need more people for that. And you ideally want a lot more people in the planning process. But from what I've seen recently in city budgets, that's just not a priority and people don't care anymore. So good luck with that. That's that phenomenon mentioned previously where people forget that the thing happened and the funding decreases has come back full swing. Hopefully I was less mad this time. I got less angry this time, which was good. One thing that I said somewhat flippantly, and one thing that's going to come out in the article here, with a lot of the snake oil people and the people that aren't really doing what you pay in emergency management for, the reality is, and I'm not saying this to plug the book, but just to kind of prove the point here, I'm going to plug the book, but it's to prove a point. You can replace them with the Continuity 101 textbook that, we've talked about on this channel, a prepare product that I wrote. You can replace them with that and it will do a better job than paying them a salary. If you're an individual that can be replaced by a $100 textbook, you're getting replaced. You don't need AI to replace these people. Some people go into businesses and their entire function is to ask the question, what if that doesn't work? Oh, we'll do this. Oh, okay, but what if that doesn't work? Well, we'll do this. Oh, okay, but what if that doesn't work? Oh, okay, but we'll do this then. Okay, but what if that doesn't work? Oh, we don't know. Oh, we should think about that. And they do that back and forth. And that's their job. And that is 90+% of all the work they do. Now, the reason why they do that is because the organization doesn't really ask that question, and that's what their job has been reduced to. Sometimes that's not their fault. Sometimes that's what the snake oil person is doing. Sometimes that's just the reality of the industry. But that person can be replaced by the CEO walking down to the lunchroom and placing a sticky note on the lunchroom fridge that says, you need to ask, what if this doesn't work? And some people might take umbrage with what I just said there. In my experience, every person I've talked to in cybersecurity, in emergency management, in the consulting sphere, etc., that I know does good work, fundamentally agrees with what I just said. So that is a problem. When you are effectively replaceable by a sticky note, your career isn't sustainable. Further, I think that this industry is frankly trending with a lot of its core competencies towards being free for the vast majority of people. We put up the Continuity 101 9-ish hour condensed playlist of that entire master's course on the channel in the courses section. It's free. There's no paywall, right? At this point, the reason we're doing it is because we want people to have these skill sets and they're priced out of it, because your mom and pa shop cannot afford, the $100,000+ for these programs. And frankly, I'm at a point now of preparedness where I just don't care. I want people to stop dying. So here's the information for free. Just because I'm doing it doesn't mean I'm going to be the only person doing it. This is where this industry is going. You need to compete with free. And that's not sustainable to pay your mortgage. So I know this has been kind of doom and gloomy, but you asked, this is basically a response to a doom and gloom question effectively. The reality is that emergency management has been shrinking for a long time. It will shrink for a long time until we solve the question of how to get people to care about preparedness fundamentally. This is where it's going, and it's going to always be where it's going. Hopefully, the utilization of AI and other technological advancements improves the risk toolbox of whoever remains in this industry when the dust settles. There's always the chance with hallucinations that it puts people into a false sense of security and it makes it worse, which is depressing. But hopefully, with fewer people, we get better at this. Hopefully. If you're someone who's thinking about getting into this industry and wants to be able to be someone who lives on a single income, that's a very bad idea. There are very, very, very few people who make a living in this industry, virtually anywhere in any sector of it. You are far better off going to work in one of the specialized risk capacities, like being a hydrologist, being a police officer, being high up in an insurance company, etc. And then, leaning on your skill set to help with that. There is not money in this industry, and there's not likely to be for quite some time. So this is a great thing if you're in one of these industries and you want to pick up the skill set. This channel is here to help everybody learn how to do emergency management. But one of the realities about teaching everybody to do emergency management is you don't need emergency managers anymore if everybody has the skill set. So hopefully we can all be emergency managers, and then we can all do it for free. Huzzah.